Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. It was on the evening of October 28th, 1839, when the first peculiar occurrence was noted in the records of Wilkes County, Georgia. A document, yellowed with age and nearly illegible from water damage, indicates that Sheriff Thomas Calloway was summoned to the Ashford Plantation, approximately 7 miles east of Washington, Georgia. The document, discovered during courthouse renovations in 1958, contains only the briefest mention of a domestic disturbance requiring intervention. What makes this record remarkable is not what it says, but rather what was later struck through with thick black ink, a single line reading, "Concerning the disappearance of D. Grow." In 1839, Wilkes County was known for its sprawling cotton plantations and the growing tensions that would eventually lead to civil war. The Ashford Plantation stood as one of the oldest estates in the region, having been established in the late 1700s by Colonel William Ashford, a Revolutionary War veteran who had been granted the land for his service. By 1839, the plantation was under the sole ownership of Mary Ashford, a widow of 37 years, who had inherited the property following her husband's death 3 years prior. County records indicate that at the time of James Ashford's death in 1836, the plantation housed 43 enslaved persons. Among them was a man called Daniel Crow, who appears in the inventory of estate as one male Negro, age 36, skilled carpenter and overseer, valued at $1,200. What the inventory fails to mention is that Daniel had a wife, Sarah, who was also enslaved at the plantation, and that they had been permitted to live together in a cabin separate from the other enslaved persons, an unusual arrangement that would later become central to the unfolding mystery. The autumn of 1839 in Georgia was unseasonably cold. Multiple journal entries from various county residents remark on early frosts that damaged late cotton harvests. It was during this cold snap that Mary Ashford began to make changes to her household arrangements. According to the Journal of Elizabeth Willoughby, wife of the local physician, Mrs. A has taken to strange habits following her period of mourning. She has moved the Negro carpenter to the main house, citing a need for extensive repairs. Many find this highly improper, though she dismisses all concerns. What Elizabeth Willoughby could not have known, what no one in Washington society could have suspected, was that this seemingly innocuous decision would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately be buried from official record for more than a century. The Ashford Plantation's main house stood atop a gentle rise, overlooking fields that stretched to the distant tree line of oak and pine. Built in the Georgian style with symmetrical windows and a wide central hallway, it projected prosperity and order. The white columns supporting the front portico had been installed by James Ashford just before his death, a final attempt at displaying the family's status. Behind the house, beyond the kitchen garden and smokehouse, sat a row of cabins where most of the enslaved persons lived. Apart from these, standing alone near a small stream, was the cabin where Daniel and Sarah Crow had made their home for nearly a decade. On Sundays, the enslaved population was permitted to attend services at a small church on the edge of the property. The minister's records from 1839 note increasing attendance throughout the summer months, but by October he writes of a troubling absence of certain members of Mrs. Ashford's household. The same record mentions that prayers have been requested for Sarah, who is taken ill with a wasting disease. Dr. Richard Willoughby's medical ledger, partially preserved in the Washington Historical Society archives, contains an entry dated November 2nd, 1839. Called to Ashford Plantation to attend to female Negro with consumption, condition poor, Advised removal to drier quarters. Mrs. Ashford declined recommendation. A later entry, dated November 12th, simply states, "Patient expired, no further visits required." With Sarah's death, Daniel Crowe became a widower. County death records contain only the briefest mention. Negro woman, property of M. Ashford, buried on plantation grounds. No name is given, merely a property transaction completed. It was in the weeks following Sarah's death that neighbors began to notice changes at the Ashford plantation. Nancy Wilkinson, whose family owned the neighboring property, wrote in a letter to her sister in Augusta, "Mary has dismissed her house slaves and now relies solely on the carpenter. They take meals together, I'm told by my cook, who heard it from their stable boy. I cannot imagine what has possessed her to behave in such a manner. James would be scandalized." The letter continues, describing how Mary Ashford had begun to decline invitations to social functions, how the plantation seemed to withdraw from county life. "The gates remain closed," Nancy wrote, "and when I called to pay my respects, I was told by a young Negro girl that the mistress was indisposed and seeing no visitors. Through the parlor window, I glimpsed movement, a man's figure, too tall to be any of the house servants I recalled." By December of 1839, rumors had begun to circulate through Washington society. The nature of these rumors is alluded to in a sermon delivered by Reverend Hiram Parker on December 15th, in which he condemned improper relations that violate both divine and man's law, and called for Christian intervention in situations where a soul may have strayed dangerously from the path of righteousness. Though no names were mentioned, the church records note that Mary Ashford had not attended services for 3 consecutive weeks. On the night of December 23rd, according to Sheriff Calloway's log, a group of 12 men from prominent Wilkes County families arrived at the Ashford plantation. The official record states only that they came to express community concern regarding the management of the estate. What happened that night was not recorded in any official document, but fragments exist in private correspondence that paint a disturbing picture. A letter from Thomas Wilkinson to his brother in Charleston, dated January 2nd, 1840, makes an oblique reference. "The matter with the Ashford widow has been addressed. We found conditions as rumored, though worse than imagined. The offending party has been removed. Mary remains under the care of the Reverend's wife. The doctor has been called twice. She speaks little, but continues to ask after her husband, not James, mind you. The property will likely pass to James's cousin from Savannah once matters are settled. What happened to Daniel Crowe? No death record exists. No sale is recorded. He simply vanishes from all official documentation after December 23rd, 1839. In January 1840, Mary Ashford was committed to the Georgia State Lunatic Idiot and Epileptic Asylum in Milledgeville. The commitment papers, signed by Dr. Willoughby and countersigned by Reverend Parker, cite moral insanity and delusions regarding her social position and relations. She remained there until her death 17 months later. The official cause was listed as brain fever, though asylum records indicate she refused food for the final weeks of her life. The Ashford plantation was indeed transferred to James's cousin, William Ashford of Savannah, who sold much of the enslaved population and eventually sold the property itself before returning to Savannah in 1843. The main house burned to the ground in 1847. The land was later subdivided for smaller farms. For nearly a century, the story of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crowe remained buried in scattered documents and family whispers. It might have stayed that way if not for Dr. Eleanor Tanner, a historian researching antebellum race relations at the University of Georgia in 1954. Dr. Tanner's discovery began innocently enough. She was examining court records for cases involving the legal status of enslaved persons when she came across a partial transcript from a closed county hearing dated January 1840. The document concerned the disposition of the Ashford estate and contained testimony from multiple witnesses. Most of it was procedural, but a statement from Nancy Wilkinson caught her attention. "I believe Mary's mind broke when she discovered that Daniel had been meeting with Sarah in secret. After Sarah's passing, she became convinced he was now truly hers alone." This fragment led Dr. Tanner to search through private collections and family papers, eventually gaining access to the Willoughby family documents, which had been donated to the Atlanta Historical Society, but remained uncatalogued. There, she found Elizabeth Willoughby's complete journal, which contained entries far more detailed than the sanitized public records. According to Elizabeth's private writings, Mary Ashford had indeed brought Daniel Crowe into the main house following her husband's death, initially as a handyman performing needed repairs. But as months passed, their relationship changed. Elizabeth wrote on September 12, 1839, R. returned from Ashford Plantation deeply troubled. He says Mary no longer refers to D as her servant, but has taken to calling him Mr. Crowe in private. She has given him James's clothing and watches him dress each morning. R. fears she has lost her reason entirely, but more troubling is that the man appears to accept this arrangement. Elizabeth's journal suggests that Daniel Crowe's participation was not willing but coerced. R. believes the man fears for his wife's safety, she wrote. Mary has moved the sickly woman to the damp storage cellar, claiming it will prevent contagion, though R. has told her repeatedly that this will only worsen the consumption. When D. objects, she threatens to sell his wife to the traders heading west. The most disturbing entry comes from October 31st, 1839. Mary came to call today, bringing D. with her. She introduced him as my husband Daniel and spoke of their plans to travel north in the spring. When I expressed shock, she became agitated, insisting that they had been properly married and that God himself had blessed their union. D. stood silently, eyes downcast. When Mary stepped away to admire my new curtains, he whispered, "My Sarah still lives. Please send help." Before I could respond, Mary returned, and they departed promptly. Sarah died less than 2 weeks later. What happened after Sarah's death is documented in Elizabeth's journal with increasing horror. Mary now keeps D chained at night, she wrote on December 1st. R saw the marks on his ankles when he was called to treat a fever at the plantation. The other slaves are terrified, speaking of how the mistress has taken to parading D through the quarters, announcing him as master of the estate. She has had him whip any who refuse to acknowledge him as such. The journal entries grow increasingly disturbed as Elizabeth recounts stories brought back by her husband and the house servants. She writes of Mary forcing Daniel to read to her from James's books each evening, of dressing him in her dead husband's clothes, of introducing him as Mr. Ashford to the few visitors she still received. She has created a grotesque puppet show, Elizabeth wrote, with D as the unwilling performer. The entry for December 24, 1839 is the most revealing. R returned at dawn, clothes soiled and hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his tea. They found D in the master bedroom, chained to the bedpost. Mary had dressed him in James's wedding clothes. The things R described, I cannot bear to commit them to paper. The men took D to the old mill. R would not tell me what was done, only that justice was served as required. They brought Mary to our house after. She alternates between calling for James and for Daniel, seeming not to know the difference any longer. Her hands are bloodied from clawing at R when they separated her from D. She keeps asking when her husband will be returned to her. Dr. Tanner's research paper, which would have revealed these events, was never published. University records indicate that her funding was suddenly withdrawn in 1958, and she was offered a position at a small college in Oregon. Her collected materials were allegedly lost in transit. The only trace of her work that survives is a brief abstract submitted for a conference presentation that was subsequently cancelled. In 1968, during the construction of a highway that cut through part of the former Ashford lands, workers uncovered human remains near the site of the old mill. According to county records, the bones were determined to be of considerable age and were reinterred in the Washington Town Cemetery without further investigation. No marker was placed. Local legend in Wilkes County speaks of the old Ashford property as being troubled ground. Farmers who later worked the land reported tools going missing, unexplained cold spots even in summer, and a persistent feeling of being watched. One account from 1942 describes a tenant farmer's child who claimed to see a tall man in old-fashioned clothes standing at the edge of the field who would walk a few paces before vanishing. Some older residents of Washington still claim that on certain autumn nights, particularly as the first frost approaches, the sound of chains can be heard near the creek where Sarah and Daniel's cabin once stood. Others dismiss such tales as mere superstition, a way to explain the uncomfortable history that lies beneath the surface of their community. The story of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crow represents one of the many unacknowledged horrors of America's past, not supernatural terrors, but the very human capacity for obsession, possession, and cruelty. It speaks to the ways in which power corrupts, how isolation warps the mind, and how systems of oppression create conditions for unique and terrible forms of suffering. Perhaps most disturbing is how effectively this history was erased, how those with influence could literally rewrite the narrative, striking names from records, committing inconvenient witnesses to asylums, and ensuring that certain stories remained untold for generations. In 1961, a historian named Marcus Collins attempted to follow up on Dr. Tanner's research. His notes, deposited in the University of Georgia archives, contain this final entry. I am convinced that what happened at the Ashford Plantation was deliberately concealed by the leading families of Wilkes County. Their descendants continue to hold positions of influence. My inquiries are increasingly met with closed doors and veiled threats. Some stories, it seems, are not meant to be told. And perhaps he was right. But the truth has a way of persisting, in fragmented documents, in whispered tales, in the uneasy feeling that comes when walking certain patches of ground. The story of the widow who took her slave's husband as her own may never be fully known, but its echoes continue to resonate across the Georgia countryside, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary people with power and a willingness to use it without mercy. For those who know where to look, the signs are still there. The creek where Sarah and Daniel lived still runs cold and clear. The hilltop where the main house once stood remains empty, as subsequent owners have found reasons not to build there. And in the Washington Historical Society, carefully preserved but seldom displayed, is a wedding portrait of James Ashford from 1829. Visitors who have seen it sometimes remark on the shadow visible in the background, a tall figure that the artist seemingly began to paint but then obscured with dark pigment. Society volunteers explain it as a common painting technique of the period. But those who know the story might wonder if it represents something else, a premonition, perhaps, of the man who would unwillingly take James's place in his widow's disturbed mind, and who would ultimately pay the highest price for a role he never sought. The past is never truly buried. It merely waits beneath the surface, patient and persistent, until someone digs deep enough to uncover what lies beneath. Vim de narrativein. 1963, a graduate student named Catherine Mercer came across an unusual item while cataloguing donations to the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. Among the personal effects of William Ashford's great-granddaughter was a small leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. Initially categorized as a household ledger, closer examination revealed it to be something far more unsettling. A diary belonging to Mary Ashford, spanning from June 1838 to December 1839. The diary had somehow survived the plantation fire, likely because William Ashford had removed it when he took possession of the estate. Why he preserved it, rather than destroying such damning evidence, remains unclear. Perhaps he kept it as a warning to future generations, or possibly as leverage against the families who had taken matters into their own hands that December night. Catherine's discovery should have been a significant historical find, but within days of her initial examination, the diary was removed from the collection by the Society's Board of Directors. Catherine was informed that the item contained material inappropriate for public consumption, and that her research focus would need to shift to another topic. When she protested, her academic advisor suggested that continuing to pursue the matter would jeopardize her future career prospects. The diary itself disappeared into private hands, but not before Catherine had transcribed several pages into her research notes. These fragments, later donated to a small library in Athens, Georgia, in 1987, following Catherine's death, provide the only known direct insights into Mary Ashford's deteriorating mental state. The earliest entry, dated June 12, 1838, begins innocuously enough. Daniel completed repairs on the east wing today. His craftsmanship exceeds that of any white carpenter in the county. James always said he had remarkable hands. I find myself watching those hands as he works, remembering how James would praise them. By August, the entries take on a more disturbing tone. Daniel resembles James in certain lights. I noticed it today as he stood by the window installing the new molding. The way he holds himself, the set of his shoulders. When he concentrates, his brow furrows just as James's did. I asked him to remain in that position so I might observe it longer. He seemed confused but complied. September 3rd. I had Daniel try on James's waistcoat today. The fit was surprisingly good, though the sleeves are somewhat short. He was reluctant until I reminded him of my generosity in allowing his wife to remain in their private cabin despite her inability to work. He is learning to be grateful for my considerations. October 17th. Sarah's cough grows worse. Daniel has been distracted, requesting permission to tend to her rather than completing his duties in the house. I reminded him that his primary obligation is to me now. The others speak when they think I cannot hear, but I know they whisper about the new arrangements. They will learn to accept them in time. November 1st. Daniel attempted to leave the house tonight after I had retired. I heard his footsteps on the stairs and found him dressed, clearly intending to return to Sarah. I explained that a husband belongs in his wife's bed, not sneaking about in the darkness. He said nothing, but his eyes held such hatred. I've had Johnson secure the doors and windows. Daniel will understand eventually that this is best for everyone. November 13th, the day after Sarah's death. Daniel wept today. I permitted it for a time, then reminded him that Providence has simply removed an obstacle to our happiness. He became quite agitated, requiring restraint. Dr. W. provided a sedative, suggesting it was shock and grief causing such ingratitude. I've had Daniel move to the master bedroom, where I can better monitor his condition. The chains are a temporary measure until he accepts his new position. The final entry, dated December 22nd, 1839, is the most disturbing. We are husband and wife in all but documentation, and even that can be arranged with sufficient funds. Daniel spoke my name today without prompting and accepted James's ring on his finger. Progress comes slowly, but it comes. Tonight, we shall consummate what God has ordained. I've explained that his former life is no more, that he is now Daniel Ashford, master of this plantation, alongside his loving wife. The others watch with resentment, but they will obey or be sold. I hear horses approaching. Late visitors are most unwelcome. The entry ends abruptly, presumably interrupted by the arrival of the 12 men from prominent families who would forever change the course of events at the Ashford Plantation. What makes Mary's diary particularly unsettling is not just the documentation of her descent into obsession, but the clinical, matter-of-fact tone with which she describes her actions. There is no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no recognition of Daniel's humanity or agency. In her distorted reality, she was simply claiming what she believed to be rightfully hers. In 1965, construction workers renovating an old building in Washington that had once served as the county records office discovered a hidden compartment behind a brick wall. Inside was a metal box containing several documents that appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Among them was a partial transcript of an unofficial hearing conducted by Sheriff Calloway on January 2, 1840. The document, badly damaged by water and time, contains fragmented testimony from several individuals present during the December 23rd incident at the Ashford Plantation. One statement, attributed to Thomas Wilkinson, describes finding the Negro Daniel chained to the bed, dressed in the clothes of the late Mr. Ashford, with the widow in a state of undress beside him. When questioned, she referred to him as her husband and became violent when we attempted to separate them. Another fragment from Dr. Richard Willoughby. Upon examination, the Negro man exhibited numerous injuries consistent with prolonged restraint and text illegible, clear evidence of psychological torment. He alternated between periods of complete silence and agitation, particularly when the widow called his name. The most revealing testimony comes from Johnson, identified as the Ashford Plantation's head house servant. Mistress changed after Master James died. At first, just small things, having Daniel eat at the kitchen table instead of the quarters, giving him better clothes. Then she moved Sarah to the cellar, even though we all knew it would make her sickness worse. Daniel tried to help Sarah, but Mistress would punish him if he spent too long away from the house. After Sarah passed, Mistress made him wear Master James's clothes, made us all call him Master Daniel. At night we could hear text missing. Those who objected were whipped or sold. We knew it wasn't right, but who would believe us over a white woman? The transcript ends with Sheriff Calloway's summary. Given the sensitive nature of the events and the standing of all parties involved, this court finds it in the best interest of the county that no official record be made of the proceedings, the Negro Daniel having been dealt with according to the judgment of the assembled men and Mrs. Ashford now being in the care of medical professionals, this matter is considered resolved. This document is ordered sealed. The discovery of these concealed records prompted a brief investigation by local authorities, but by 1965, most of the directly involved parties had long since died. The documents were transferred to the State Archives in Atlanta, where they were catalogued but largely forgotten, a footnote in Georgia's complex racial history. However, the story found an unexpected champion in 1967 when Eliza Crow, a schoolteacher from Albany, New York, began researching her family history. Tracing her lineage back to freed slaves from Georgia, she discovered possible connections to an ancestor named Daniel, who had disappeared from records around 1840. Her search led her to Wilkes County, where initial inquiries were met with polite but firm resistance. Undeterred, Eliza expanded her search, visiting historical societies, church archives, and university collections across Georgia. In the Baptist church records from a small congregation near the former Ashford Plantation, she found a brief entry from 1839 listing Brother Daniel and Sister Sarah, servants of the Ashford estate, among the faithful. A margin note added, "Remember them in prayer as they face tribulations." What Eliza uncovered next would prove crucial to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. In the University of Georgia archives, she discovered personal correspondence between Richard Willoughby and his brother in Baltimore, dated February 1840. In it, the doctor confessed, "I cannot sleep for thinking of what we did at the mill. Though the law would say justice was served, I find no peace in it." The Negro man was not a willing participant in Mary's madness. That much was clear from his condition when we found him. But the others would not listen to reason. Their concern was only for preserving the social order, not for justice or mercy. May God forgive what I failed to prevent. This letter suggests that Daniel Crowe, rather than being viewed as an accomplice in violating social taboos, was himself a victim. First of Mary Ashford's psychological torment, and then of the vigilante justice of 12 prominent men, unwilling to acknowledge his victimhood because of his race and status. Eliza's research culminated in a slim volume published by a small press in 1969, Silenced Lives, Race, Power, and Justice in Antebellum, Georgia. Though it received little attention from mainstream historians, her work was preserved and eventually recognized for its importance in understanding how intertwined systems of power, racial, gendered, and class-based, could create conditions for extraordinary abuse that could then be erased from official history. In 1974, an elderly woman named Margaret Wilson contacted the Wilkes County Historical Society with an unusual contribution. Her grandfather had been a carpenter, tasked with dismantling the remains of the Ashford Mill in 1882. During the demolition, workers had discovered a small tin box concealed in the mill's foundation. Inside was a hand-carved wooden figure of a woman holding a child, along with a folded piece of paper containing a message written in barely legible handwriting. "Sarah and our child that never was. Daniel Crowe, his mark, 1839. The item had been kept by Margaret's grandfather and passed down through the family, its significance not fully understood, until Margaret read a newspaper article referencing Eliza Crowe's research. The carving now resides in the National Museum of African American History and Culture, a tangible connection to lives that powerful interests had tried to erase from memory. But perhaps the most chilling piece of evidence emerged in 1978, when renovations at the former Georgia State Lunatic Asylum uncovered patient records that had been walled up during previous construction. Among them was Mary Ashford's file, including session notes from Dr. Horace Stillman, who treated her during her 17 months at the institution. Dr. Stillman's notes reveal that Mary never acknowledged any wrongdoing. Instead, she maintained until her death that she had been widowed twice. First when James died, and again when they took my Daniel from me. Most disturbing are the entries from her final weeks. Patient continues to insist that she can hear chains at night. Claims Daniel is still bound, waiting for me to release him. Refuses food, stating she must join him properly this time. Physical restraint continues to be necessary as she attempts to harm herself with any available implement. The final entry, dated May 28, 1841, reads simply, "Patient expired at 3:17 a.m. In her final moments, she became suddenly lucid, asking, "Is he waiting for me?" Before an answer could be provided, she suffered a seizure and could not be revived. Burial to be arranged as per agreement with W. Ashford of Savannah. No ceremony requested. In 200 years since the events at the Ashford Plantation, the landscape of Wilkes County has changed dramatically. Cotton fields have given way to other crops, then to developments and highways. The stream where Daniel and Sarah's cabin stood has been redirected, its course altered to accommodate modern needs. The site of the mill where Daniel likely met his end now lies beneath the waters of a man-made lake, created in the 1950s to generate hydroelectric power. Yet the story persists, not as a ghost tale of rattling chains and spectral figures, but as something perhaps more unsettling, a reminder of how power can corrupt absolutely, how privilege can shield the worst abuses from scrutiny, and how easily the suffering of those deemed lesser can be struck from official records. Dr. Jerome Watson, a historian specializing in antebellum Georgia, wrote in a 1997 analysis, "The case of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crowe represents a unique inversion of established power dynamics that was ultimately corrected through extrajudicial violence. What makes this case remarkable is not that such abuses occurred, they were tragically common, but that the particular circumstances created documentary evidence that survived despite coordinated efforts to suppress it. For every such story that has emerged, countless others remain buried, their victims denied even the dignity of being remembered. Today, visitors to Wilkes County who know the story sometimes stop at the old cemetery where Mary Ashford was buried in an unmarked grave, or walk the shoreline of the lake that covers the mill site. Some leave flowers or small tokens near the spot where Sarah and Daniel's cabin once stood. It is a quiet acknowledgement of lives entangled in a tragedy born of obsession, oppression, and the terrible inequities of the world they inhabited. In the county courthouse, a small plaque installed in 2002 acknowledges the incomplete nature of historical records and commemorates those whose stories were erased from official documents but live on in memory and truth. It does not mention the Ashford plantation specifically, but those familiar with the research understand its significance. The most recent development came in 2009, when ground-penetrating radar was used to survey the area where the Ashford plantation house once stood. Researchers discovered evidence of a previously undocumented cellar beneath what would have been the east wing, the section Daniel had been repairing when Mary first began to notice his resemblance to her late husband. Excavation revealed a small room with unusual features: iron rings embedded in the stone walls and floor, a narrow window too small for escape, and scratches in the soft mortar that appeared to form words or tallies. Carbon dating of organic material found in the cellar suggests it was actively used in the late 1830s. Among the artifacts recovered was a silver button bearing the initials J.A., likely from one of James Ashford's garments. How it came to be in this hidden room remains a matter of speculation, but its presence seems to connect the space directly to the events described in the fragmented historical record. Archaeological analysis concluded that the cellar had been specifically modified for confinement, not the temporary restraint commonly used to punish enslaved persons, but long-term captivity. This physical evidence lends credence to the most disturbing accounts found in Elizabeth Willoughby's journal and Mary's own diary. The land where the Ashford plantation once thrived is now divided among several properties. The current owners have varying levels of awareness about its history. Some embrace it, allowing researchers and descendants access to conduct investigations or simply to pay respects. Others prefer not to acknowledge the darker aspects of the property's past, focusing instead on its agricultural history or architectural significance. This tension between remembering and forgetting, between confronting uncomfortable truths and maintaining more palatable narratives, mirrors the broader struggle with historical memory throughout the American South. The story of Mary Ashford and Daniel Crowe exists in that contested space, too well documented to be completely erased, yet too unsettling to be fully embraced as part of the regional identity. Perhaps the most fitting memorial comes not from official markers or academic texts, but from an oral tradition that has developed among some local families. They speak of telling Daniel's story as an act of witnessing, acknowledging that what happened was seen, even if those who saw it were powerless to intervene or were complicit in covering it up. The telling becomes a form of delayed justice, ensuring that the truth, however painful, survives. In the end, the horror of what occurred at the Ashford Plantation in those autumn and winter months of 1839 lies not in supernatural elements or Gothic trappings, but in its terrible plausibility, in the recognition that when power operates without accountability, when obsession meets opportunity, and when society values some lives above others, the conditions exist for atrocities that can then be buried almost without trace. The story serves as a reminder that history is not simply what is recorded in official documents, but also what persists in margins and footnotes, in family stories and local legends, in the unexplained gaps that demand closer examination. It reminds us to question absences and to consider whose voices have been silenced in the narratives we inherit. As darkness falls over the Georgia countryside and the wind rustles through pine trees that have grown tall since Mary, Daniel, and Sarah walked beneath them, their story continues to resonate, not as a ghost tale to frighten listeners, but as a sober reminder of human capacity for both cruelty and resilience, and of our collective responsibility to remember even those histories others have tried to erase. For in remembering, we acknowledge not only what was lost, but what persists despite all efforts to suppress it. The fundamental humanity of those who lived and suffered, loved and endured, on grounds that history tried to render silent, but which still speak to those willing to listen.